Okay, this video is about Gwendolyn Brooks. So, our first of the postmodern poets that we're discussing, her dates are 1917 to 2000. So, we are getting closer and closer to some authors of your current generation, and we are teaching a few living authors: Alice Walker, Billy Collins. Gwendolyn Brooks was born in Kansas, but she grew up in Chicago and closely identifies with that city and that culture. And a lot of her, especially her early poetry, is about like the blue collar workers in Chicago, particularly the African American demographic, and just kind of their plight in the early 1900s and the oppression and the struggle and the poverty that a lot of African Americans were focusing, especially, in the city. So, and we do see that in the two poems that we're reading by her. She was well educated, so she was able to go to college. She studied poetry. She learned from, many of the modern poets like Pound and Cummings, and she was also definitely influenced by the writers of the Harlem Renaissance that we talked about in the modern period. So a lot of influence from Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen and some of those other writers who were bringing Black identity to the forefront of their poetry, and we see that as well in some of her poems. Her early poetry was very people-centered in the sense that she wrote a lot of character sketches, and we're looking at that in The Mother and in We Real Cool, where she focuses on like a kind of a category of people. Her later works, however, were much more political, as she really got, as with so many African American authors, um, into the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, and just a whole lot more overt political statement about civil rights. So you do kind of see that shift in her poetry if you study it throughout the course of her life. So the first poem we're going to discuss, "We Real Cool," which you can see on, this is in your textbook on page 309. And I'm actually going to, and I hope this works. I've never shown a video on my screen recordings before, but I'm going to play you a clip of Gwendolyn Brooks reading this poem. So let's listen to this.
We real cool, the pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we binge in, we jazz June, we die soon.
We real cool, the pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon.
Okay. And of course, it's always better if we hear Morgan Freeman read it as well. So I love that video, and it is interesting to hear the author herself read it. So let's talk about it a little bit. It's a pretty straightforward little poem, but what I want to draw your attention to is the rhythm of the poem and how the rhythm reflects the setting. So if you were following what's going on there, then you could see that this poem is about these, young people who have skipped school, and they're at a pool hall. And there's 7 of them, and the name of the pool hall is the Golden Shovel. And what's interesting is the rhythm of the poem, "We real cool, we left school," mimics the sounds that you would hear in a pool hall. So if you've ever played pool, you know that each time somebody takes a turn, you're going to hear at least three distinct noises. You're going to hear the cue stick hitting the cue ball. You're going to hear that cue ball hitting another ball. And then hopefully, if you're good, you're going to hear that ball going into the pocket, right? So clunk, clunk, clunk. And she has captured that rhythm with the writing of her poem. So that's a really neat thing, that she kind of takes us to the setting in her, with the form of the poem. And then, of course, the irony of the final line is that it is not cool to die young, right? And so her message in this poem is that education is important, right? So you guys think you're so awesome, skipping school, having fun, but that's not actually a cool thing to do, because education has been shown to give you a better quality of life, and even is there are correlations with longer life with having education. So that's her message there. But basically characterizing these young people as defying authority. And she has some really great alliteration and word choices here that you can see. And so a neat little poem about kind of the rebellion of youth. Okay, I'll make sure I'm still recording here. All right, so the other poem we're talking about with Brooks is called The Mother. So you need to flip back a page to page 307. This is a lengthier poem, and this poem is a little more intense. And this is actually a really good representation of postmodern poetry. It's raw, it's gritty, it's dealing with a difficult subject. And Brooks, of course, she's very intense about it. So what's interesting about The Mother is that in a lot of ways it reads like a treatise, kind of an argument of sorts, and it starts with a claim. So let's read a little bit. These first couple lines say, "Abortions will not let you forget. You remember the children that you got that you did not get. The damp small pulps with a little or with no hair, the singers and workers that never handled the air." So that first line, "abortions will not let you forget," is a pretty strong claim. And it's interesting, usually a poem about abortion or any kind of writing about abortion is going to be focused on the morality of it. Is it right? Is it wrong? And that from the get-go, that doesn't seem to be her focus. The focus is more on how abortion affects women. And her primary claim is that an abortion will never, never leave you. It is something that will always be with you. That unborn child will stay with you your entire life. And it's not like a choice. You don't get to forget them. So it's a pretty strong claim, and it's a pretty powerful way to think about abortion. And then in those other first few lines I read, I think it's really interesting how she compares the different views of unborn children. If you look at line 3, it describes them as damp, small pulps with a little or with no hair, which would typically be the description of someone who is pro-choice, right? This is not actually a person. It's fetal matter. It's just flesh. It doesn't even have hair yet. There is no actual person there. So we have that description. But in the very next line, she identifies the unborn children as singers and workers that never handled the air, and she gives them personhood. She gives them identity. This unborn child could have had a job. He could have had a skill. He could have had talent, but they never got to experience it. So what she's doing here is she's helping us step into the tension of this person, this mother, who is trying to reconcile an abortion that she's had. Was that a person? Was it not? And it's a really, really raw kind of tension that she's asking us to step into. And you can also see in this first line, this first stanza, if you look at line 5, she says, "You will never neglect or beat them or silence or buy with a sweet." So that makes us think about, the reasons that women had abortion, especially in this time period, guys. This was written in the 40s, when it was illegal to have an abortion. So if you had one, it was not done, in a sterile, safe environment. It was very sketchy. It was very dangerous. Um, but women had abortions because they were afraid these children would be neglected or beaten or impoverished, right? There was no, they didn't have hope for a good life for these children. It was because they were in poverty. So she's saying, that child will never be neglected. That child will never be abused. It's never going to be silenced or bribed, these negative things. But then she goes back to the other side. She is again sitting in that tension. She says, "You will never wind up the sucking thumb or scuttle off ghosts that come. You'll never leave them controlling your luscious sigh, return for a snack of them with gobbling mother eye." So some of the beautiful components of motherhood, of, seeing your child sleep, of scaring away the ghosts, of comforting them, of, all those beautiful things of motherhood. So she's saying, bad things won't happen to these children, but good things aren't going to happen either. So it's really intense look at in abortion here. And then it's interesting in the second stanza, she shifts from second person to first person. So I think for the audience, it kind of eases us in a little bit to this very intense subject with you. We're like, so it's kind of this, nebulous person out there, very abstract, to the I, and it makes it more personal. And the first line of that second stanza is really a doozy. I have heard in the voices of the wind the voices of my dim killed children. That's very intense to think about, someone who's had an abortion actually hearing the voice of that child, whom they chose to take its life. So she really wants us to think about how abortion is affecting this woman. And it's not just one child, it's plural children. So this has happened more than once. And I want you to understand too, this is kind of a traditional type of poem where Brooks is creating a persona. We don't assume, it's not known or assumed that Brooks herself had abortions. She's just talking about kind of this persona who exists in this time period, in the culture and the context that she's in. And then we're going to move to the end of the poem. I'm not going to read the whole thing. And it kind of comes to a conclusion that this narrator is struggling to make. So I will read you these 10 lines here at the bottom. Starting at line 20. If I poisoned the beginnings of your breaths, believe that even in my deliberateness, I was not deliberate. Though why should I whine that the crime was other than mine, since anyhow you are dead, or rather, or instead, you were never made. But that too, I am afraid, is faulty. Oh, what shall I say? How is the truth to be said? You were born, you had body, you died. It is just that you never giggled or planned or cried. So basically, again, she's trying to decide, these unborn children, was this a person or was it not? This idea of, you were never made, so you were never actually a person. And she's like trying to grasp, what is the truth? You were born, you have body, you died. And so the narrator does seem to come to conclusion that these unborn children were people, that they had identity and existence, but there was death. And it's interesting, even those lines that we just read, she kind of has a little justification there. Believe that even in my deliberateness, I was not deliberate. So even though I made this choice, it wasn't on purpose. So basically, I think the idea she's trying to get across here is that I didn't have full knowledge of the choice I was making. And we've all done that. We've all made decisions that had much greater fallout than we anticipated, much more long-reaching consequences. And so I think that's what she's trying to say there. And even this idea of, why should I whine that the crime was other than mine? It takes two people to make a baby. So even kind of like, there was someone else involved, and yet I had to make this difficult choice, which brings up questions again of even rape or things like that. We don't know. We don't know the context of this person's story. So yeah, really gut wrenching in those last couple lines where she speaks and this whole second stanza, she's talking um, to these unborn children. Believe me, I loved you all. Believe me, I knew you though faintly, and I loved you all. Just gut wrenching to think about. And so this is postmodern poetry, just sitting in the darkness, sitting in, the pain that people are experiencing, and just trying to give words to it. And so then I always do kind of come back to this idea: does this author have a moral stance towards abortion, or is that the primary point of the poem? And I would say not necessarily. The focus here is more on how abortion um, affected this woman, the effects of abortion on women. It's not necessarily a pro life poem or a pro choice poem. Although, if you had to pick one, I would say it probably leans more towards the pro life side. But that certainly isn't, this poem isn't an argument as to why abortion is wrong. Which brings us to a really interesting question. The title of the poem, The Mother. So, can this woman who has had multiple abortions be considered a mother? Does she get that title? What makes a mother a mother? Is it birthing a live baby? Is it being a biological mother? We all know women who have not been able to have children biologically, but are mothers by adoption. So I'm just going to leave that question with you to think through on your own. Does this woman deserve to be called a mother? And kind of Brooke's statement there, entitling her poem The Mother. So I just want you to kind of think about that. It is a really interesting question to consider. So, like I said, this poem is kind of a dark introduction to the postmodern poets, and I'm sorry to say we're going to get even darker with Sylvia Plath in the next video. However, this is the world we live in. There's a lot of deep dark questions that people are considering and issues that they're dealing with. So I hope the video was helpful, and